I never thought a parking lot could change my life. But that's exactly what happened on a Tuesday morning in October. The kind of morning where the air still smells like rain even though it stopped hours ago, and I was standing beside my car watching two strangers scream at each other over a space barely big enough for a compact sedan when, out of nowhere, two other cars I had never seen before slammed into each other not 15 feet away. And in the 3 seconds of stunned silence that followed, before the shouting started up again about insurance and dashcams and whose fault it was, I did something I still can't fully explain. I stepped back. I let the woman who had been arguing take the spot, and I walked into the coffee shop like nothing had happened at all. Except something had happened, something had shifted. And I wouldn't understand how much until months later when she was sitting across from me asking why I did it. And I still didn't have a good answer, because the truth is, I don't think I decided anything. I think some part of me had already decided long before that morning that I was tired of watching people fight over things that didn't matter while the things that actually mattered slipped past unnoticed. But let me take you back to the moment this all started, because if I just tell you the ending, you won't understand why it mattered so much. You won't understand her, and you definitely won't understand me. So let's go back to 7:40 in the morning, to the lot outside the little corner coffee shop 3 blocks from my apartment that I'd been going to for 2 years because the owner remembered. My order and the chairs by the window got the best light in the mornings, and I want you to picture the lot the way I saw it that day. Half full, tight, the kind of lot where you have to time your turn just right, or you lose the spot to someone coming from the other direction. And that morning there was exactly one open space near the entrance, and 2 cars converging on it at the same moment. Hers, a silver hatchback with a dent in the back bumper that looked recent, and his, a black SUV that looked like it had never once been washed by hand. And I was already parked, already walking toward the door, when I heard the first raised voice, hers, sharp and furious, saying that she had signaled first, that she'd been waiting for the spot for a full minute while he circled the lot pretending not to see her, and his voice came back just as hard, saying he didn't owe her anything, that it was first come, first served, and he'd pulled in first. And I stopped walking because something about her voice wasn't just angry, it was frayed, like she was one bad morning away from falling apart, and this parking spot had become the one thing in the world she could still fight for. And I want to be honest with you. My first instinct was to keep walking, to mind my business. Because that's what you do in a city. You let people have their small dramas, and you go get your coffee. But something kept my feet planted on the sidewalk. Maybe it was the way she kept pressing her palm flat against her sternum like she was trying to hold something in. Maybe it was the tremor under the anger. Whatever it was, I stayed. And that's when the accident happened. A third car, and then a fourth. Both of them pulling out of parking spots at the same time, from opposite ends of the row. Neither driver checking their mirrors the way they should have. And there was a sound I will never forget. Metal folding into metal, not loud exactly, more like a heavy final thud, glass tinkling onto asphalt like wind chimes. And for one full second nobody moved. The woman and the man, mid-argument, both froze their mouths still open, their eyes suddenly somewhere else entirely. And then the chaos started. People spilling out of the coffee shop, a man in an apron yelling for someone to call for help, the 2 drivers who'd been in the actual crash, stumbling out of their cars, looking dazed but unhurt, and the woman who'd been fighting for the parking spot just stood there, hands still pressed to her chest, staring at the wreck like it had personally reached into her morning and rearranged something. And I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment where nobody's thinking about a parking spot anymore. And so, without deciding to, without even really thinking it through, I turned and got back in my car and pulled it forward 8 feet so the space by the entrance was hers. Completely hers. No argument left to have, and I parked in a spot further down that I probably should have taken in the first place. And I walked into Winslow's without saying a single word to her. Because what would I have even said? Congratulations. You get the parking spot because 2 other people crashed their cars. That felt wrong somehow, too pleased with itself. So I just went inside, ordered my usual flat white and a croissant that was always a little too warm on the outside and a little too cold in the middle. And I sat by the window like always, and I watched, and I saw her finally park in that spot, saw her sit in her car for almost 2 full minutes without moving, her hands still on the wheel, her head tipped back against the headrest, and I understood in that moment that whatever was happening in her life went a lot deeper than a parking spot, that the parking spot was never really the thing was something else entirely, something she was carrying that had nothing to do with cars or spaces or who signaled first. And when she finally came inside, her eyes were red in that specific way that told me she'd been crying before any of this ever started. Not because of the crash, and not because of the argument. Something older. Something that had been sitting in her chest since before she ever left the house that morning. And she ordered a coffee in a voice that was trying very hard to sound normal, and almost succeeding. And the barista, a kid named Eli who worked mornings and always had something kind to say, told her it was on the house, that the shop covers 1 drink a week for anyone who's had, in his words, a morning like that, which wasn't true. There was no such policy. I found that out later. He'd made it up on the spot because he saw what I saw, and she thanked him, confused but grateful. and took a seat 2 tables away from me, and for a while neither of us said anything. We were just 2 people in a coffee shop after a strange morning, and I want to tell you that I worked up the courage right then to say something, but I didn't. I sat there with my flat white going lukewarm and baha. I watched the light come through the window and land across the surface of her cup, and I thought about how strange it is that we can stand 15 feet from someone's entire, unraveling life and know almost nothing about it. And then, because the universe apparently wasn't done with us yet, the sound of sirens grew louder outside. An officer came in to ask if anyone had witnessed the second collision, and one by one people raised their hands, described what they'd seen, and when it got to her, she said something I didn't expect. She said she hadn't actually seen the crash because she'd been arguing with someone about a parking spot when it happened, and there was a small, embarrassed laugh in her voice. The kind that comes when you realize how small your problems look next to what almost happened right beside you. And the officer asked who she'd been arguing with, and she looked around, scanning the shop, and her eyes landed on me, just for a second, because I was the only person there who fit, and I gave a small nod, an acknowledgement, nothing more, and she looked away quickly, like she'd been caught doing something, and that was it for that day. That's how it started, not with a conversation, not with an introduction, just to people in the aftermath of something loud, sitting in the quiet that followed. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because so much of what came after started in that silence. In the not talking, in the noticing without acting. And if you've ever loved someone who didn't know you yet, you'll understand exactly what I mean. That particular kind of attention where you're not trying to get anything, you're just paying attention because some part of you already knows this person matters, even before you know their name, and I didn't know her name for another 11 days. 11 days of seeing her at Winslow's at almost the same time every morning, always in the same corner table, always looking a little tired in a way that seemed to be getting heavier instead of lighter. And I want to fast forward through some of those mornings, because not all of them matter to the story, but a few of them do. Like the morning I noticed she'd started bringing a laptop and typing furiously for 20 minutes, before closing it and staring out the window for the rest of her coffee, like she was fighting with something on the screen and losing. Or the morning she dropped her keys on her way out and I picked them up before she noticed, holding them for a beat longer than necessary, just to feel the small metal weight of a stranger's whole life in my palm, before handing them back with a quiet, "You dropped these," and she thanked me without quite meeting my eyes, still a stranger to me in every way that mattered except the ways that were starting, quietly, to matter most. Or the morning Eli told me, without me even asking, that her name was Naomi, that she'd started coming in around the same time her mornings apparently got harder. His word, harder, not sad, not difficult, harder, like something had to be pushed through rather than simply lived. And I remember thinking that was a strange word for a barista to choose, but somehow, exactly right. And then there was the morning. It rained so hard that half the regulars didn't show up, and it was just me, Naomi, and an elderly man named Frank who came in every day to do the crossword and complain about the coffee prices. And I don't know what made that morning different. Maybe it was the rain against the glass. Maybe it was that the shop felt smaller somehow, more like a room and less like a public place. But when she got up to leave, her umbrella, a plain black one that had clearly seen better days, wouldn't open. The little button mechanism just clicked uselessly, over and over, and I heard her mutter something under her breath. Not quite a curse, more like a sigh with teeth in it. And I stood up before I even decided to, walked over, and asked if I could take a look, and she handed it to me with an expression that was somewhere between suspicion and relief. And I fiddled with the spring mechanism for a few seconds, felt the little metal piece that had slipped out of place, pushed it back with my thumbnail, and the umbrella popped open with a soft mechanical sigh. And she laughed, actually laughed, for the first time since I'd started watching her. And she said, "You're the parking lot guy, aren't you?" And I said, "I am absolutely the parking lot guy." And she said, "I never got to say thank you for that." And I said, "You don't have to. It wasn't really a big gesture." And she said, "It was actually more than you know." And there was something underneath those words that I didn't fully understand yet. Some weight she wasn't handing me all at once. And I told her my name, Caleb, and she told me hers, Naomi, and we stood there under the awning for a minute longer than we needed to, her broken but fixed umbrella between us like a strange little peace offering. And then she said she had to go, work, always work. And I said I hoped the rest of her day went easier than her mornings had been lately. And something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, that I'd noticed her mornings had been hard. And she said, "You've been paying attention." And I said, "A little." And she said, "That's either very sweet or a little unsettling." And I said, "I'll let you decide which." And she smiled, a real one, the first unguarded smile I'd seen from her in 11 days of quiet watching. And for just a moment the tiredness lifted off her whole face like fog burning away in early sun. And she pulled her collar up against the rain and walked out into it with her umbrella held high. And I stood there for a long moment after she left, feeling something in my chest that I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. And I want to be honest with you, I had exactly 4 minutes to decide whether I was going to let this become something or let it stay. A nice memory about a broken umbrella. 4 minutes before Eli called my name because my order was getting cold on the counter, and in those 4 minutes I decided, quietly, privately, that I wanted to know this woman, not just watch her, know her, and that decision is the whole reason the rest of this story exists. Because 2 weeks later I worked up the nerve to sit at her table instead of mine. Not with any plan, just a plain question. Mind if I join you? And she looked up from her laptop, surprised. And after a pause that felt longer than it probably was, she closed the screen and said, actually, yeah, I could use the distraction. And that was the first real conversation we had. 45 minutes that turned into missing half of her workday and all of my morning routine. And I learned that she worked in logistics for a shipping company. That she'd moved to the city 2 years ago after a relationship ended in a way she didn't want to talk about yet. That her mornings had gotten harder, her word this time too, not evil, because her mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's 6 months earlier, and Naomi had been driving out to see her every single morning before work, 40 minutes each way, to help her get ready for the day before the home aide arrived. And that was why she was always tired, always a little frayed, always fighting a little too hard over things like parking spots. Because the parking spot wasn't really about the parking spot. It was about being the one thing in an exhausting day that she could actually control. And when she told me that, I understood the tremor in her voice from that very first morning. I understood the hand pressed against her chest, and something in me settled. Like a question I hadn't known I was asking had finally been answered. And I told her a little about myself too. That I worked as a high school English teacher, that I'd grown up 2 states over, that I'd learned to fix small broken things. Umbrellas, bike chains, wobbly table legs. Because my father ran a hardware store and some habits just stay with you. And she said that explained the umbrella. And I said everything explains something if you look closely enough. And she looked at me for a second longer than the moment required and said, that's a very teacher thing to say. And I said, guilty. And we both laughed. And from that morning on, our mornings started overlapping on purpose instead of by accident. Some days just a nod and a few words. Other days full conversations that spilled past the point either of us should have left for work. And I want to tell you it was easy after that. But it wasn't. Because Naomi carried her mother's illness like a stone, she refused to set down even for a moment. And there were mornings she came in with her eyes swollen and her jaw tight, and she'd wave off any question with a tired smile and say she was fine, just tired. And I learned not to push, to just sit with her in the quiet the way I had that very first day at the window, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is not ask them to perform being okay. And there was a Tuesday, almost 2 months after the parking lot, when she came in and didn't even try to smile, just sat down across from me and said, my mom fell this morning. She's okay. Nothing broken, but I wasn't there. I was stuck in traffic and by the time I got to her she was already on the floor and scared, and I couldn't do anything but hold her until the aide arrived. And her voice cracked on the word scared, and I didn't say anything smart or comforting. I just reached across the table and put my hand over hers, and she didn't pull away. And we sat there like that for a long time, the coffee going cold. Eli quietly refilling both our cups without being asked and not saying a word about it. And that was the moment I understood this wasn't just a pleasant morning routine anymore. This was something with roots, something that mattered in the way very few things ever really do. And I told her quietly that she didn't have to carry all of it by herself, that I wasn't going anywhere, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, something between disbelief and hope, like she'd been waiting for someone to say those exact words for longer than she'd admit. And she said, people say that and then they leave when it gets hard. And I said, I know, and I'm telling you, I'm not most people. And she said, that's what most people say too. And I laughed, because she wasn't wrong. And I said, then I guess you'll just have to watch and find out. And something about that answer seemed to land differently than any reassurance could have, because it wasn't a promise, it was an invitation to actually see. Over time, whether I meant it, but I want to be honest with you, it wasn't long before that invitation was tested. Because about 3 weeks after that conversation, Naomi pulled back, hard and fast. The way people do when they've been let down enough times that closeness itself starts to feel like a threat. And it started small. A canceled dinner with a vague excuse. A morning at Winslow's where she sat 2 tables away instead of across from me. Her laptop open like a wall between us. And when I finally asked her directly what was going on, she said flatly that she thought I should know she wasn't good at this. That every time something started to feel steady, she found a way to knock it over before it could disappoint her first. And I remember feeling something in my chest tighten. Not anger, more like recognition. Because I understood exactly what she was doing even as she did it. And I asked her if this was about her mother or about me. And she went quiet for a long time before saying, both, maybe, I don't know. And I told her I wasn't going to chase her if she genuinely wanted space. But I also wasn't going to disappear just because things had gotten uncomfortable. And I said, you don't have to perform being fine with me. But you also don't get to decide unilaterally that I'm going to leave. That's not fair to either of us. And she looked at me with an expression somewhere between anger and relief. The anger of being caught and the relief of being caught by someone who wasn't backing away. And she said, nobody's ever pushed back on me like that. And I said, maybe nobody's ever meant it enough to bother, and that night she didn't say much else. But the next morning she was back at the window table, no laptop. Just her and her coffee and an apology she didn't quite know how to phrase, so instead she just slid her hand across the table until it found mine. And that was enough. That was more than enough. And I think that was the moment I understood that loving Naomi wasn't going to be about grand gestures. It was going to be about staying steady during the moments she expected me to leave, again and again, until eventually she stopped expecting it. And over the following weeks I proved that in smaller ways too. Driving her mother's favorite soup over on a night Naomi had to work late, sitting with her mother, whose name was Ruth, while Naomi took the first real break she'd had in months, listening to Ruth's stories about raising Naomi alone after her husband left. Stories that helped me understand why Naomi fought so hard for control over the small things, because for most of her life the big things had been entirely out of her hands. And there was one evening in particular I remember clearly. Ruth sitting in her worn armchair with a photo album open on her lap, showing me pictures of Naomi at 7 years old, gap-toothed and fierce, arms crossed in front of a birthday cake because someone had put the wrong flavor frosting on it. And Ruth laughed and said, she's been fighting for the right thing to happen ever since she could talk. She just usually forgets that people are allowed to be on her side. And I asked Ruth what changed, why she thought Naomi had let me stay around this long when she'd clearly kept other people at arm's length. And Ruth studied me for a moment, the kind of look that felt like it was measuring something deeper than the question itself. And she said, you didn't ask for anything. That's the difference. You gave up a parking spot expecting nothing back. And my daughter has spent her whole life with people who only give when they want something in return. And I sat with that for a long while after I left that night, turning it over, understanding for the first time just how much weight that small, ordinary morning had carried without my knowing it. And I started showing up in quieter ways after that, learning which of Ruth's medications needed to be taken with food, fixing the loose hinge on her screen door that had been squeaking for a year, sitting through entire evenings of old game shows because Ruth liked the noise of it and Naomi liked not having to entertain anyone for once. And none of it felt like sacrifice. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, the way you'd expect love to feel if nobody had ever told you it was supposed to be complicated. And Ruth Sharpet, even with her hands starting to tremble, looked at me over a cup of tea one evening and said, my daughter doesn't let people in easily. You should know that. And I said, I've noticed. And Ruth said, so don't waste the invitation. And I told her I didn't intend to. And I meant every word of it. And I want to tell you about the week that tested that promise more than any other. Because about 10 weeks after the parking lot, Ruth had a bad fall, a real one this time. One that landed her in the hospital with a fractured wrist and a concussion that kept the doctors watching her overnight. And Naomi called me from the hospital parking lot at 11 at night, her voice shaking in a way I'd never heard before. Not the frayed, controlled shaking of a hard morning, but something raw, something closer to panic. And she said, I don't know why I'm calling you. There's nothing you can do. And I said, I'm already putting my shoes on, and I drove out there without asking permission, because some invitations you don't wait to have repeated. And when I got to the hospital I found her sitting in a hard plastic chair in the hallway outside her mother's room, knees pulled up to her chest, and she looked up at me like she couldn't quite believe I'd actually come. And I sat down next to her without saying anything. And after a long silence she said, this is what I was trying to warn you about. This is what loving me actually looks like. Hospital hallways and phone calls at midnight and me falling apart in ways that aren't pretty. And I told her that I hadn't signed up for a version of her that only shows up on good days. That if I only wanted the easy parts, I would have driven back home hours ago instead of sitting in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. And she cried then, quietly, the kind of crying that comes after holding something in for far too long. And I put my arm around her, and we sat like that until a nurse came out and said Ruth was stable, resting, going to be fine, just needed to be monitored through the night. And Naomi exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. And when we finally went in to see Ruth, groggy but lucid, the first thing Ruth said, looking between the two of us, was, well, at least somebody around here has good judgment about parking spots. Which made absolutely no sense to the nurse in the room, but made both Naomi and me laugh for the first time all night. A real laugh, cracked open by exhaustion and relief. And that night, driving Naomi home at 2 a.m, she fell asleep against the passenger window somewhere around the 4th red light. And I remember glancing over at her, at the dried tear tracks on her face, at the sheer tired trust it took for her to let herself sleep in front of me, instead of holding herself together. And I thought, this, whatever this is becoming, this is worth every hard morning that comes with it. And there was a night, maybe 3 months after the parking lot, when Naomi and I sat on the small balcony of her apartment, the city humming below us, and she asked me, out of nowhere, why I really gave up that parking spot that morning, because she said she'd thought about it more times than she wanted to admit. And I told her the truth, that I'd been standing there watching her argue, and something about her voice told me she wasn't really fighting about the parking spot. She was fighting because it was the only fight available to her that morning. And when the crash happened, giving her the spot felt like the only thing I could do that wouldn't make things worse. And she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "That's the first time in a year that I've felt like someone actually saw me instead of just looking at me." And I didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to add to that. I just reached over and took her hand, and we sat there together while the city lights blurred slightly with the tears she didn't bother wiping away. And that was the night everything shifted from something careful and tentative into something neither of us was willing to pretend was casual anymore. And I won't walk you through every month that followed, the ordinary stability of it, dinners, her mother's good days and bad days, the slow way trust rebuilds itself brick by brick after life has taught you to expect it to collapse. But I will tell you about the morning, almost a year to the day, after the crash in the parking lot. When Naomi and I pulled into Winslow's at the same time, in the same lot, and there, in that same spot near the entrance, was one open space, and out of habit, out of the old reflex, she started to angle her car toward it, and then she stopped, laughed at herself, and looked over at me through the windshield, and mouthed, "You take it." And I shook my head and mouthed back, "No, you." And we sat there for a second, two cars idling side by side, neither of us moving, both of us laughing at how far we'd come from the two people who'd once been ready to fight over exactly this. And eventually she pulled in and I parked further down, exactly the way that first morning had gone. Except this time when I walked up to the entrance, she was waiting for me by the door, instead of walking past me like a stranger. And she took my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. And inside, Eli looked up from behind the counter and said, "The usual," and we both said yes at the same time, and sat down together at the same window table where all of this had somehow begun. And I looked across at her, at the woman who had once gripped a steering wheel for 2 full minutes just trying to hold herself together. And I thought about how strange love is, how it doesn't always arrive with fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the decision to step back instead of forward, in the space you make for someone without even knowing their name yet. And Naomi reached across the table, took my hand the way she had that first rainy day with the broken umbrella, and said, "Thank you for the parking spot." And I said, "Thank you for taking it." And she laughed, a little embarrassed, and said, "You know, my mother still tells that story to anyone who will listen. The man who gave up his parking spot for a stranger having a bad day, she's convinced it means something about fate." And I said, "What do you think it means?" And Naomi was quiet for a moment, turning her cup slowly in her hands, and then she said, "I think it means some people notice you even when you're not asking to be noticed." And that used to scare me more than almost anything, because it meant someone could actually see how much I was struggling, and now it's the thing I'm most grateful for. And I told her that noticing her hadn't been a decision so much as an instinct, something that felt inevitable the moment I saw her standing in that lot. And she reached into her bag then and pulled out something small wrapped in a napkin, and when I unwrapped it, it was a tiny metal keychain shaped like a parking sign, the kind with a single letter P on it, and she said she'd found it at a flea market months ago and had been carrying it around for weeks, trying to decide if giving it to me would be too much or exactly enough. And I told her it was exactly enough, and I've carried it on my keys every single day since. A small dumb piece of metal that means more to me than almost anything else I own, because it reminds me that the biggest turns in a life rarely announce themselves. They just show up disguised as an ordinary Tuesday morning, a broken umbrella, a stranger's kindness you didn't ask for and almost didn't accept. And outside the window the lot was ordinary again. Cars coming and going, people hurrying in for their coffee, no crashes, no shouting, just an ordinary morning in an ordinary city, except for the two of us sitting quietly by the glass, holding on to something that had started with almost nothing at all. And I think about that morning often, how close I came to just walking past, how easy it would have been to mind my own business, to keep my eyes on the door and let two strangers fight over a few feet of asphalt, the way 100 other mornings had let 100 other small moments pass unnoticed. And I'm endlessly grateful that some part of me, some quiet, patient part I didn't fully understand at the time, chose instead to stay, to notice, to give up something small so someone else could have exactly what they needed, because sometimes the biggest love stories don't begin with the loudest moments. They begin in the silence right after the crash, in the space we choose to give each other when it matters most. And if you take nothing else from this story, take that the smallest, quietest acts of kindness are sometimes the ones that end up mattering more than anything we ever say out loud.